I think now, more and more, it's out there on the agenda, it's being seriously talked about, and it is closer, both because we're nearer to it, but also because it is looking much more likely than it has been at any point during my 15 years in the European Parliament. Just one little pointer in that direction, of course, is the recent prize offered by, sponsored by Next for the best paper on the British exit, or Brexit as it's called. And I know that a number of fairly heavyweight people have put up proposals for that. Yes, well done. And the prize eventually went to, I'm sorry I forget the name, but I'm looking forward to reading his submission, the prize-winning submission, because I think that will be very exciting, especially on a day when it's announced that Simon Wolfson, who sponsored the prize, has also given away his £3 million bonus to his staff. Well done, Lord Wolfson. As a major contribution to this practical debate about actually what it means to leave the European Union, my good friend and colleague, the Earl of Dartmouth, has produced what I have to say is a magisterial work, and I'm not quite sure who did the artwork and the layout, but it is beautifully accessible and generally speaking a remarkably professional document. But I've got to tell you also that it includes propositions about trade and our trade position when we leave that I myself, after 15 years arguing the case, was not familiar with. There is stuff in here that anybody who is engaged in the debate about the European Union should be aware of. I will be honest, I haven't read the whole of it, but I'm looking forward to reading it, perhaps chapter by chapter, given the time constraints in which we're under. It is a superb piece of work, and with that I don't think I need to say any more, except to invite William to run you quickly through it.
Right. Roger, first of all, as the late Sir David Frost used to always say, good morning and welcome. I think there's a litany of thanks and acknowledgements inside the front cover, but I must just pick out a few. First of all, I must thank Roger Helmer very much for coming along and also for chairing our meeting. And in the litany of thanks, I must particularly thank Lizzie Short, who, above and beyond the call of duty, superintended the very lengthy work of the presentation of the report, which many people have praised. I must also particularly mention Lena Olsen, Tony Brown, and Michael McManus. I also must give a mention, it would be inappropriate not to Vital Moreira, MEP, and the other MEPs on the International Committee of the Trade of the International Trade Committee of the European Parliament, who I think unwittingly very much helped my education. So let me just give you, if I may, the bones of it. I first of all draw your attention to the slide, which is actually the back cover of this. Now we are UKIP, the UK Independence Party, which is what we always will be, but we could as well have been called the UK Internationalist Party. The fact is that Europe is not big enough for us, and the EU certainly is not, and it actually never has been. And the slide there shows this very clearly. Now, the UK's loss of sovereignty to the EU, open borders and the rest, are often justified on the grounds of trade. So trade is mostly what this report is about. Now on trade, I'm going to come up with a revelation that may surprise many people in this building, and it is this. Our country does not need to be in a political union in order to be able to trade. And here are two slides. Ooh dear. I pressed the one. Is it, I've forgotten which one I pressed. Ah.
Never got it to the day when I was the technical person, but...
Oh, that's the one.
There. Yeah, that one.
Two slides showing the countries that are the top 40 exporters to people and businesses located in the European Union. That's the bottom 20. And these figures are from Eurostat itself, so they are, as it were, the very tablets from Mount Sinai. And here is the first slide, where at number 40 is the United Arab Emirates, where many years ago I used to live and work. And here is the second slide. And you will see the cumulatively sheer volume of trade from even just the top 10 countries. And I'm just going to make 3 points. The first is that and I'm going to show you a simplified slide, which is just the top 10, which is much easier to read. And I'm just going to make 3 points. The first is that 6 of the top 10 member states to the EU, top non-member state exporters to the European Union in 2012, did not have trade agreements. Indeed, they still do not. Second, China at number 1 sold just short of 290 billion euros of exports to people and businesses in the European Union. And no way China, Mr. Clegg and others, is in the EU, and it never will be. And third, what is noteworthy is the sheer volume of exports to the top 10. In fact, if you added that together, it is greater than the entire economy of Spain. So let me be crystal clear. A country does not have to be in a political union in order to trade. Not remotely, not at all. The UK would absolutely not be turning our backs on the EU markets when we leave the EU. And that all trade would cease is not a tenable proposition. The facts are clear. There is no reason to suppose that any trade would be lost at all. And that is why the largely made-up statistic of 3 million jobs, which we've been hearing for the last 15 years, is meaningless. Trade would continue and the jobs would continue, whether the UK is in or out of the EU. And those 2 Eurostat charts and the fact of China very clearly demonstrate that. Now, we all know, now I'm going to talk about trade agreements. We all know, but not everybody does, in fact most people don't, that since 1975, all the UK's trade agreements have had to be negotiated by the EU Trade Commissioner. And he or she has to take into account not just the interests of the UK, or for that matter Italy, but the interests of all 28 member states. Now, when we look at the EU's trade agreements, it's worth spelling out that the EU has agreements that encompass trade with over 100 countries. In fact, we've counted 126. And these 126 trade agreements are in 6 different categories that we have found. In fact, I think there are more categories. Mexico, not in Europe, and South Korea are 2 of the countries with full trade agreements with the European Union. And they are not, and they never will be, in the EU political union. After exit, a UK-EU trade agreement is absolutely inevitable. There will be one. But I must emphasize that a trade agreement is not necessary in order to trade. We've just seen that with China and the 6 other starred countries, none of which have got trade agreements with the EU. Now, giving up our right to negotiate trade agreements and the rest is often justified in terms of the influence that the UK has within the EU. So let's talk about influence. Let's see how much influence the UK actually has in the EU. This is the UK percentage vote in the Council of Ministers under qualified majority voting. It's now, we simplified, it's actually 8.24% since the accession of Croatia. And of course, it's interesting that it was 17% in 1973, which was when the UK negotiated its entry into the EU. And by the way, as more countries come in, the proportion of EU votes in the Council of Ministers, and therefore our influence, goes commensurately down. And it is a little bit bizarre that the establishment parties in the UK are all cheerleaders for more and more countries to come in, including and massively Turkey. And now let's look at MEPs. MEPs actually don't have much influence, as Roger can testify. However, we have got an MEP election coming up. And you will see here that in 1979, the first year of direct election, the UK had 19.8% of MEPs in the European Parliament. After 2014, it will be 9.7%, more than halved. And as for EU commissioners, which I don't think there is a slide on the EU commissioners, is there? You could never get this one done. The point is we originally appointed 2 of 13 commissioners. We now appoint 1 of 28. So I think you could work out that that's quite a dramatic proportionate drop. The fact of the matter is, the facts are clear. The UK's influence in the EU is negligible, and the mantra of influence, 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 which we hear all the time, has absolutely no basis in reality. Now let's go to the free movement of people. Article 3.2 of the consolidated version of the Treaty of European Union lays down free movement in persons. In consequence, over 450 million people from the 27 states of the other 27 states of the European Union have the absolute right to live, work, and settle in the EU. There are sometimes transitional arrangements, but transitional arrangements are by definition transitional. But the fact of the matter is that open trade does not mean open borders. There are 16 free trade areas in the world, and specifically the North American Free Trade Area, which is normally known as NAFTA, between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. There is no free movement. There is free movement of goods and services. There is not free movement of people, as anybody who's watched various television programs showing the work of the US and Canadian Border Control would know. We want open trade. We do not want open borders. Now, let me address the EU share of global wealth. The EU share of global wealth, defined as its share of world output, is in long-term decline. This was its share in 1980. European Union, 30.9% of the world economy. Very impressive figure. In 2014, roughly now, it's less than 20%. Now, trends are trends, but if you extrapolate those figures, according to the IMF, you now find that in 2039, it is predicted to be less than 9.9%. Now, these figures, I must point out, include the very large UK economy. Without the UK economy, the EU's share of wealth would be materially and significantly lower. Now, let's also talk, so in other words, is it so exciting being tied up with this declining economy? Now, let's talk about tariff reductions. There have been very large tariff reductions since the UK joined the then common market in 1973. And there's a graphical depiction of it there. And this is an important point. To the UK, to be in the EU customs union is now worth an awful lot less than it was when we joined. And now let me come to my final 2 points. This is on large trade blocs. Some people say that a country has to be in a large trade bloc in order to be able to sign trade agreements. It sounds convincing, but the facts demonstrate that it is just not true. It is, in fact, the other way round. It's more difficult because you have to take into account the interests of 28 member states as opposed to just one. And Switzerland, for example, has a bilateral free trade agreement with Japan, which the EU does not. Switzerland also has a trade agreement with China, which the EU does not. A very small country, New Zealand, has a trade agreement with China. And little Iceland has a trade agreement with China. In comparison, the European Union has no trade agreement with China and no trade agreement with Japan. Now, this sadly is not in the report because I didn't think of it, but a British think tank has come up with the following list here, which is that List A is the 7 agreements which Switzerland has with countries which the European Union does not. And List B is agreement of the 5 countries with which the European Union has trade agreements and Switzerland does not.
San Marino.
That list, I must say, I'm very excited that we have trade agreement with San Marino. I must visit it sometime. Oh, by the way, parenthetically, I have to say that there's a very old friend of mine who is Italian but has reinvented himself as the representative of San Marino at the UN. Anyway, that list was produced by Civitas, but there was some dazzling research work done in my office principally by Lizzie Short, and we took it a little bit further. And so we added up the gross domestic product of the 7 countries with which Switzerland has got trade agreements, and the EU does not. And we added up the gross domestic product of the 5 countries with which the EU has trade agreements, and Switzerland does not. And you see the totals there, and you come to the staggering amount that the GDP of the Switzerland countries, let's call them that, are almost 30 times more than those in the second list. It is just not true, not remotely true, that a country needs to be in a political union in order to be able to sign trade agreements. And I'm going to amplify the point. This is my last point. Now, the EU is currently negotiating a trade agreement with the United States, known as TTIP. And it was put to me when I was interviewed by a broadcaster, sadly only a local broadcaster, because that's my lot in life. That's my lot in UKIP, which may have been the BBC, that the United States would only be interested in signing a trade agreement with the UK if it were a member of the EU. Now, the United States does, so I decided to actually look at the facts, and here they are. The United States currently has trade agreements with 20 countries, and that's a list of countries. And each one of those countries has a GDP smaller than that of the United Kingdom. It is entirely clear a country does not need to be in a large trading bloc in order to negotiate trade agreements, and it certainly does not need to be in a political union. So this is the conclusion. On trade alone, the UK should leave the European Union. We would thereby regain the ability to negotiate trade agreements in our national interest. We would immediately reactivate our seat at the World Trade Organization. And more than that, our exit, which I didn't refer to, would relieve 92% of the UK's economy, which does not trade with the European Union, from the burdens of EU regulation. The fact is, to trade and trade it successfully, we do not need to be part of a wannabe European superstate. And what we are putting forward on trade, as well as in other matters, is very simply common sense, the politics of positive, the politics of answer, and what is the best way forward for the future of our country. And that is why the UK should be, to quote the title of our report, out of the EU and into the world.
Excellent stuff, William. Can I say that I mean, this is a very, very impressive presentation. I want to pinch some of those slides.
Please,
and blog about them, if I may. I mean, everybody involved in the debate really ought to hear what William has just had to tell us. Do we have questions? Are you willing to take questions?
Delighted.
Good.
Yes.
Do we have any questions?
Somebody's had a question. Why does somebody start a question, set the ball rolling? Yes, sir.
And, thank you so much for the report. It was really informative. And I know that it was limited to trade, but how would you address sort of another criticism that is always thrown out, that it's also about the common market, that by being out of the EU you would have to sort of surrender to, that your financial services companies would not be able to shape regulation, and that by not having free movement of people, London would suffer a drought of talent?
Well, shall I answer? There's actually 2 questions. Let me answer them one at a time. In terms of shaping regulations, we aren't shaping regulations at the moment. I mean, regulations which are entirely destructive of the City of London as a financial centre have been pushed through in the teeth of UK opposition, and the future of the City of London looks rather uncertain. If we got ourselves out, we wouldn't be submitting to it. And I do touch on that in the report on page 22, paragraphs, whatever, paragraphs. In terms of free movement of people and starvation of talent, the whole point is this: we want to be able to choose who we have to live in our country. We can't choose who we have to live in our country, so long as we're in the European Union and we have de facto open borders to 450 million people. Now, I mentioned in my first opening remarks that I lived and worked in the United Arab Emirates for 2 years of my life. When I was a newly qualified chartered accountant, I took a job in the UAE, because at that time there weren't any jobs. It was in Abu Dhabi, actually, which that stage no one had ever heard of. I had a 2-year work permit. The company I worked for paid for my medical and for my housing. And when the 2-year work permit was over, I had to come home. And how we would get talented people is by giving work permits. Now, to actually answer that question in a slightly more profound way, if I may also, what's actually happening in the UK in terms of talent is this. Because we can't control EU immigration, the entire weight of immigration control falls onto non-EU immigration. So if you're an unskilled Romanian, for example, not to be unkind to any particular nationality, with no English, no qualifications and no prospects of getting work, you have the absolute right to live, work and settle in the United Kingdom. But if you are, for example, an Indian or a Canadian or an American heart surgeon or somebody with a PhD in solar energy or higher physics and the rest, you're subject to the full weight of immigration control. It's exactly the other way around.
If I may abuse my position in the chair, just to add an extra comment, I'm always fascinated by this idea that we need to be there to shape the rules that control our financial services industry, as though having an 8% vote in Brussels was better than having 100% ability to regulate our own industry. And equally, we do an awful lot of trade, both in, well, business and financial services, and in many other areas, with America. I never hear anybody saying it's terrible that we're not the 51st state of the United States because we have no say in those decisions in Washington. They make their decisions without consulting us. It is true of all independent countries. They make their own rules, and they are better off making their own rules than accepting somebody else's.
And they can change them. And the other point is they can change them if they don't work.
Yeah.
You can't. I think, can we say with a...
Your arguments make a lot of sense, but so why is the City of London so vociferously opposed to when the balance of the review of competences came out recently? And I'm citing, I think it's the lobby group for the City of London that said that it was broadly correct, and J.P. Morgan and Morgan Stanley and Merrill Lynch all came out with sort of statements strongly suggesting that Britain would be better in the EU than out of the EU. So why do the essence of the financial service industry seem to disagree?
Well, if you ask your slaves whether they're content to be in a position of slavery, it's only the very brave ones who get up and say, no, it's a rotten idea, we want out.
Merrill Lynch is a slave?
Well, they want to get the best deal they can out of the European Union, and therefore they do not want to upset the European Union. There is also a sort of corporate inertia in these things. It's a bit like climate change, there is a sort of paradigm that takes a little while to break down. And there has been a well-established paradigm in British industry, especially large industries, which tend to benefit more from the exclusion of competitors. They tend to be more sympathetic to the European project. Certainly, Nigel Farage spends a great deal of time in the city talking to city people.
And getting donations.
And getting donations. But it's very much, I'm sorry to make the comparison, I'm very excited about climate change, but in both cases, you get the individuals on one side over a beer, and they say, well, of course you're right, but we can't say things like that publicly. I think that's a big element of it.
Just come back on that point that there's a group, I think it's Business for Britain, that a press release there about 6 weeks ago, and they called attention to 2 surveys, one by YouGov, which showed that 65% of businesses in Britain wanted an in-out referendum, and 75% in a poll by British Chambers for Commerce wanted an in-out referendum. But they also, about 3 weeks ago, had a report on the issue of UK influence within the European Union, and they found that since 1996, that 55 times the UK at the Council of Ministers has been completely outvoted in a kind of red line issue, which they called when they asked for legislation to be stopped. So 55 times over the last
And that
20
was every
years.
time. That
Yeah,
wasn't sort of
every
55 out of
every
100.
time.
Every time they tried to
they've been
stop
stopped.
a piece of
Yeah,
legislation.
so
they
that
lost.
shows UK influence
In other words,
at the
no
minute.
influence at all.
Yeah.
No meaningful influence, perhaps.
Yeah.
Meaningful.
Any more questions? Everybody wants to go to lunch, I can tell. Aha, Tony's coming up with one.
It's more of a comment than a question, but I'll. Having had a look through the report, one of the things that it seems to me to emphasise is that actually it is really only the trading relationships which are the important aspect of our current EU membership from the British point of view, in the sense that it was trade and beliefs about trade and markets which caused us to join in the first place. And as the EU has evolved into much more of a political union than a trade-based set of relationships, it means that the UK's essential interest is actually a conservative one of keeping the relationship as it was when we joined for the reasons that we thought we were joining. In other words, if we were to leave, when we leave, the sole aspect on which we really need to concentrate in our future relationship is in fact the trading one.
Exactly, and that's actually why you don't want to have Vince Cable being the person doing the negotiations. I mean, so not in any ad hominem way, because his beliefs are of a certain
He's
kind.
a lovely guy.
Just a very quick question. I know that William and I have discussed this in the past. Maybe you'd like to say a few words about how the European Union often politicises trade. It's not just about business as far as they're concerned. They often politicise it. Maybe you could say a few words about that.
The alpha point, which I either forgot to make or thought it was too long, is that it's actually worse than the interests of 28 countries. It's that people from we're influenced by, for example, you talked about the City of London. Well, there was a large amount of legislation that's been passed through that was proposed by a Belgian Green. So a Belgian Green, influences what goes on in the UK. Now in trade, what happens is that other political parties use it as an opportunity to tack on their agenda.
And the social partners, so-called.
Exactly. And I'll give an example of this, which is actually rather telling, is that the negotiations for TTIP, the EU, the US, to get this right, the proposed EU-US transatlantic trade partnership was suspended for 3 months in order to respond to social concerns. We would say that social concerns are legitimate, but they need to be responded to outside the realm of trade. It was on the BBC website, actually, there. I think that's it.
Good point.
Thank you very much for your report and for your presentation. I just wanted to ask your opinion. Do you think the UK would be strong enough to be into the world, alone, without the EU? And second, as manufacturers and productions, and don't you think that maybe the EU could start a trade war with the UK?
There's two answers to that question. First of all, there's the example of Switzerland, which is doing just fine outside the EU. And indeed, Switzerland sells more than 5.5 times per capita to the European Union than the UK does. Secondly, on the thing of a trade war, first of all, the tariffs, can I go back? Does it work? No, it doesn't. That's in a way the most significant slide of the whole thing. First of all, we're talking about being outside that tariff wall, and which is very, very small. That's the not quite the worst case scenario, but that's the ultimate scenario. And then you cannot bring in, if you say, okay, there are certain people in this Parliament and certainly in the European Commission who, if the UK leave, would like to treat the UK the same way as they currently treat Iran, with trade sanctions and the rest. But that's not a serious position. But the fact is that the World Trade Organization rules, of which we would then be able to reactivate our seat, prevent a trade war of the kind which some people in the Commission and elsewhere envisage ever being launched.
Can I just add a couple of points to that, because I think it's very important. It is, first of all, the WTO. William is absolutely right. But secondly, it is just the dynamics and imperatives of trade itself. When we leave, Britain will be, first of all, the largest export market in the world, bar none, bigger than America, bigger than anywhere else. It will be the EU's largest export market in absolute terms, but also the largest net customer. We have a negative balance of payments. That's not a good thing in itself, but it does mean we're in a very strong negotiating position. We hear a lot from the auto industry about, they're very keen for Britain to stay in, but they need to remember that we buy about 80% more in terms of value of motor cars from the continent than the continent buys from Britain. So the overwhelming commercial pressure will be to maintain those flows of vehicles. So commercial pressure
and other things,
and other things, but commercial pressures. The third thing is the Lisbon Treaty itself. If you read Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty, which covers the terms on which a member state may leave, it places a treaty obligation on the remaining, as I like to call it, the rump EU, to negotiate favourable trade terms with the member state who leaves. So you've got those three different things, the WTO, natural commercial pressure, and the treaty obligation, all of which would prevent the EU starting a trade war.
So two things. First, about the WTO, it makes perfect sense, but there are sectors that would benefit Britain, for example, sort of the life insurance in India or the financial services in India, where Britain could perhaps do very well, that are currently being sheltered by developing country governments, and it's not clear that the WTO can remove barriers to entry in those fields. And secondly, it makes your three arguments make a lot of sense, but I would imagine there would be political hurdles, like at a time when austerity is being imposed and European integration hurts a lot. I can't imagine that the other 27 member states look upon a favorable trading relationship as something that's just a giveaway.
Well, trade is a two-way process, especially where we are a net customer. The last thing they want to do when they're having economic difficulties is lose a customer.
No, I understand the economics of it, but
Yeah.
I'm just saying, are you not afraid of political considerations?
This is slightly worth restating the points made earlier, but they are worth restating, and I'll do it in a very succinct form. The point about India and other markets is that the WTO is the great promoter of open trade in the world and have done it relatively successfully, as we've seen there on that slide. Now, it may go back a bit. Countries like India may become, I mean, India used to be a completely closed economy. In fact, there's a staggering statistic, which is that for about 15 years, the British colony, as a colony of Hong Kong, with 4 million people, had more exports than the entire subcontinent of India. It was that degree of a closed economy, and they have opened it up. But and it will continue to be opened up, or actually maybe it won't. But you still want to trade with it anyway, to a mutual advantage. The point about the WTO is that it prevents there being the trade war that some people in this place would like, and would advocate. And the fact is, they aren't going to be happy, but the fact of the matter is that at the end of the day, the reality talks. Now, from the point of, and to restate the point of Rogers, from the point of view of the UK as a whole, it's probably not a very good thing that we run a massive trade deficit with the EU. It is, however, that massive trade deficit is obviously very helpful if we want to negotiate some sort of trade agreement. But I've also said, and this was how I opened up by saying, if I can now, oh no, I can't. Here we are. There we are. It'd be highly desirable to have a trade agreement, but it's not predicated on that, because look at the amount of exports into the EU from countries that don't have trade agreements. And that's how I began.
May I just add a point to that? An amazing statistic from a think tank called Global Britain. They say that if Britain were to leave the European Union without any trade deal at all, so all exports from Britain to the EU would be subject to the common external tariff, the total cost of the tariff on all British imports per year to the European Union would be about £3.5 billion. Meantime, the direct costs of our EU membership net are, somebody remind me, 11, 12 billion. So the costs of membership greatly exceed the duty if we had to pay the duty. And our case is we won't have to pay the duty anyway.
In other words, the rest of the EU would have to take the view that they were prepared to cut off their nose to spite their face if they were preparing to enter into a trade war.
And even Elmar Brok will not do that.
But also, it's not actually a trade war. It's a 3.8% trade war. Well, that's an average of 3.8%, because that's roughly the level of tariffs. What they can't do is they can't say we're putting in penal tariffs on all British goods. They just can't do that against the world trade rules.
Milton Friedman once said, what's politically impossible today becomes economically inevitable tomorrow. And I'm wondering...
Well, that's brilliant, thank you.
It's a good line.
Oh, okay. You want me to repeat it?
Can we buy it?
Like shale gas, for example.
Well, this is the thing, because I said business is business. Business doesn't lie. The market doesn't lie. And I'm wondering that, because everyone knows that European Union is diminishing in terms of being, and of course, what's good for you is good for you. And do you think that all this, the threats of if you leave, and it's just because it's more of the determination solely to keep the political project alive. But then, of course, obviously, when the chips are down, Germany and France and all those will simply go elsewhere, which they're already doing. So do you think it's just they're trying to block out the inevitable, block out the inevitable somehow?
Roger has been an MEP for 15 years. Actually, 14 and a half, isn't that?
Well, very close to 15.
Very close to 15. And you've actually watched the project at close hand. So I think I'll let Roger, with his superior knowledge, answer that question.
No, I appreciate that.
It's a great question, by the way.
It's a great question. I completely accept your point of view. The European Union is becoming untenable, but it is carrying so much political investment that people are scared of giving up. There was a wonderful line in the Daily Telegraph recently, which I immediately tweeted, which said that green policies like zombie banks are too big to fail. And I think you could say the European Union is regarded by those who are involved in it as too big to fail, too important to fail, but yet it is failing and they won't recognize it. I think that one of the effects of Britain leaving will be immediately to cause a number of other countries to see how we get on. I believe that within 5 years we will be demonstrably much better off. And I think that could trigger a more general either dilution or breakup of the European Union. And I think that would be a good thing. As a famous British statesman said, we shall save England by our efforts and we shall save Europe by our example.
Can I just, on the point about just as they've threatened to do with Switzerland, that the European Union would kind of do everything possible to hurt the UK because of the desire to exit. I'm always reminded of the line by Lady Macbeth by Shakespeare, that naught is had, all is spent, when our desire is got without content. 'Tis best to be that which we destroy than rather dwell in doubtful joy. Thank you.
It's a day of quotations. Good. Are we? How are we getting on?
I think
Are we pretty much
and
through?
you might just say that people can pick up copies.
Yeah, please pick up copies. Can I thank you all for coming? It's been a very stimulating time. I've made a number of notes for tweets that I should do immediately, and I'm going to ask for copies of a couple of those charts because I can feel a blog coming on. And there is wonderful material there which our candidates should be aware of.